Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. My name is Gail O'Connor, and I am the Marketing Manager for EDT Software, one of your sponsors today. Our other sponsor today is the Gulf Coast Legal Technology Center out of New Orleans. Let me introduce the session, What's Wrong with eDiscovery? Of course, everyone can, I'm sure, chime in on that, and hopefully we'll cover a great deal of what is wrong with eDiscovery today with Joe Sherman, CEO and CEO of EDT. EDT develops case management software for litigation, investigations, and eDiscovery. Joe Sherman, our speaker today, has leveraged a law degree and a computer science major to apply technology to law in the international context. Over the last 25 years, she has held managing director and CEO roles in 3 legal technology companies which she has founded. Joe has also been engaged as a court registrar, a technology strategist, a legal business analyst, a software engineer, or architect, a Justice Department Information Governance Director, as well as a Law Society CIO. We look forward to hearing Joe's exciting comments on today's session. Our other speaker today is the well-known Tom O'Connor with the Gulf Coast Legal Technology Center located in New Orleans. Tom is a nationally known consultant, speaker, and author in the area of computerized litigation support systems. He is the director of the Gulf Coast Legal Technology Center, and his consulting experience is primarily in complex litigation matters where he has worked with firms of all sizes and has also been appointed as a technology consultant by various federal and state courts on cases dealing with large amounts of eDiscovery evidence, electronic evidence. He is a frequent lecturer on the subject of legal technology and is also a prolific writer with numerous articles in legal publications and several books, most recently, eDiscoveries for Small Cases from the ABA. I look forward to everyone's questions today, and we will try to address them as they come up, if it's appropriate. Otherwise, we will wait until the end of the session and address them then. Keep in mind, my speakers, you only have 1 hour and a lot of slides to get through. So let's get going and have a great session.
Thanks, Gail. Really looking forward to diving into this topic with you, Tom. How do we limit ourselves to 1 hour? And how do we refrain from having a glass of wine at hand or a beer or whatever your chosen poison might be while we dive into this really fun topic? I think you and I are veterans of this sector. I'm not going to call it an industry. We've been around for 20 years or so practicing in this space. So I'm really keen to hear if your thoughts are consistent with some of my musings on the topic. Tom, I thought we might start by just summarising, I guess, 3 key themes that I wanted to sort of put to you. One is that I think one of the major challenges that we still have in 2018, we still have this problem that clients really can't understand the costs. And I think we should really dive into the costs topic specifically. So I'll come back to that in a moment. But I think if we can really talk about the cost topic, that would be great. I think another theme that we should really explore is the fact that litigators actually still in 2018 don't really understand what the heck we're doing and even what's possible. So I think that's another one that we can have some fun with, and then there's the frustration of our colleagues in this domain who just sort of are saying, well, why don't you guys get it? Why don't the clients get it? And why don't litigators understand? We've been doing this for a long time now. So they're my initial thoughts, but I might sort of flip straight onto a concept or a topic that I know you're very interested to talk about. So let's talk about costs, Tom. Where do you want to start?
Well, I think I'd like to do a quick overview, if I could.
Yeah.
Of all 3 of those. We had a question posed to us ahead of time by one of our attendees.
Yeah.
She asked if there was a way to take ESI from various formats and put them into a simple folder and basically do what she called skinny tar. which was to take some series of TAR protocols, which he characterized as rough categorization, concept clusters, maybe threading, without doing everything, without going through the whole thing. Now, you're going to talk about that point specifically, which is why I wanted to bring it up. She's sort of hit one of our framing questions right on the head here, which is why are we doing all of this to everything? And we'll delve into that more. But I also wanted to mention one of my big issues is, and we're going to talk about it right here. The reason I'm mentioning it now in the per gigabyte model is definitions. This lady, Susan Haight, I hope I'm pronouncing her name properly, talks about TAR and then mentions things like concept clusters, threads, and categorization. It's important to remember or keep in mind as we go through all this, and we'll bring it up again, that not everybody agrees that those things are part of TAR. Some people define TAR as only predictive coding, and some people have very specific definitions even of predictive coding. So definitions of what you want to try to do are a real big problem here in leading the charge with costs per gigabyte charging models. It's very common to charge per gig per month and per user per month. And I think a lot of that goes back to the early days of our profession when we were taking paper and scanning it and converting it to digital images, sometimes just copying it and putting Bates labels, Bates numbering on it. One of the subjects that those engineers in your third category don't understand what the heck we're talking about. Why do you need to stamp every piece of paper with a number?
Yeah.
But the per gigabyte charging model, I think, is a real throwback to the early days of this entire profession. And when we were dealing with pieces of paper and boxes of paper, but basically a per unit model based on the document. And as you and I talked about earlier, Joe, our old friend Craig Ball says, now we have to remember that we're not dealing with documents, we're dealing with data. And the per gigabyte charging model just isn't realistic anymore. And we'll get into some more specifics about that. But I think it's the first and foremost thing that is very confusing to everybody about the costs. Is why are we charging per gigabyte? And what exactly is a gigabyte? You've got the next topic here.
Yeah. Actually, the one of the frustrations I guess I have with that model is that it really is becoming less and less related to the real costs. As a software provider and a service, solution provider in this area, storage is cheap. Everyone knows that storage is cheap. Our clients know that storage is cheap. We need to start to reflect that reality in our charging models. It's pretty hard for a client to understand that they're paying $5, $10, $15, $20 a gig per month for data when they're looking at their other solution providers or SaaS offerings, and seeing very, very low rates. So I think we really need to start working out how to properly attribute the value that we are adding to the whole solution pipeline with a pricing model that is more representative of value and cost.
Yep.
This is Gail. I just wanted to throw this in here that, Tom, you've hit another question that this one of our listeners has on the head. Should legal service vendors be charging your companies by the gigabyte for ED processing, or should the processing be free of data volume fees?
Right.
After all, the computers are performing the lion's share of the work effort. Though computers consume processing time, storage space, and electricity, these costs are very modest today. A technician must set up the processing parameters and validate the accuracy of the final outcome, and that service should be paid for commodity. But should the actual data crunching really cost anything based on incoming ESI size?
Man, that's a question and a half, huh?
I have a feeling we're going to spend an hour on the first slide.
Well, please ask our questioner to hold that thought. We addressed that exact point several times throughout the presentation. The short answer, of course, is no.
Great. The short answer is no, and we'll go a little bit deeper into that later. All right.
Yeah.
moving forward?
I would say that the principle should be charge where we are adding value. If a service provider or a consultant is adding value during the data processing stage by analysing the effectiveness or dealing manually with the problem files, there's an argument to say that there's value attached to that, and therefore absolutely. But increasingly, we need to make sure that our pricing model reflects true costs and true value at both ends.
And that's a great point, Joe, because you hearken back to what I said just several minutes ago. The definitions. What do we mean when we say processing? What we meant several years ago, and certainly what we meant 10 years ago, is far different from today, where we might have 4 or 5 different tasks included in processing, including some of the things that the woman asked in her first question: deduping, denisting, threading, all things that used to be separate tasks that often required separate softwares can now be included, and in many cases are included in processing.
Absolutely. I do have a bit of a bugbear associated with the notion that people have to pay extra to get analytics. I mean, it's like saying, imagine if Microsoft said, okay, you can use Microsoft Word, but if you want to run a macro, we're going to charge you a premium.
Right.
It's just not fair. I guess what I'm trying to say is I think we just need to be fair and reasonable when we, start to evolve our pricing models towards the future.
Well, I've got a reason why that has happened, and we discussed it at one point many times ourselves, Joe, but we'll get to that in another slide.
Sure. One of the other things I guess that I wanted to mention is the fact that, if there is anyone listening that is involved in preparing RFIs or RFPs to go to market, to seek quotes, it's very important that you differentiate source data from managed data when you're looking at per gig rates. So, for example, a source data set full of PSTs might be 1 gigabyte, but once it's expanded on disk, it could be 4 gigabytes by the time it's pushed through an analytic platform and it's expanded into text searching capabilities, etc. So it's very important to make sure that you differentiate, because you can be assured that the quote will be, if you don't clearly define that, you can be assured that in some cases the quote will be based on source data, but the invoices will be based on the managed data. Yep. And it's just something to be really careful about.
And very confusing to clients. Trying to explain that to somebody 4 weeks, 5 weeks down the road. Yes, I know you gave us 250 gigabytes, but now it's expanded to 425 gigabytes. It's tough to do.
Absolutely. Tom, you mentioned earlier the importance of predictability. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Well, I think related to cost is, of course, clients want to know what things are going to cost them, but part of that is for their budgeting purposes. They want to be able, and especially if you're working with a law firm or a government entity, to be able to budget out for 6 months, a year, even longer, and know that something is going to be at a certain cost for a certain period of time. And again, it's often difficult to do in our space, and we'll talk a little bit about how the process that we involve has worked against that. But it certainly is one of the biggest things that I see from clients when I'm going in and, as you said, Joe, answering an RFP or even an RFI. How much is this going to cost me? And not just now, but for the length of the case. I need to budget for this case. I need to be able to give my client a budget for this case. What's it going to cost me? And will you stick to that estimate as time goes on?
Quick question too. This comes from Rhino Hadronic. How does one show ROI when ED is used internally?
Whoa, that's a good one. Could we hold that to a later slide as well? I am writing these down, I promise.
Okay.
Yeah. And in short, it's sometimes good to show risk mitigation as well as ROI. Don't forget that.
Yeah.
That's part of the analysis process. Okay. I will say also, just to present a bit of a balanced view on this, there are some service providers and very talented and capable consulting firms out there that are, challenged by the fact that their business models are being, affected by software costs and new scenarios in terms of software arrangements, and I think there's always room for value add, and increasingly the opportunity, I would summarize, in our industry is to find the niche consulting service offering that you can add to the process and make sure that is appreciated and valued, and that's where you can make your margin, and that's where you can sort of build in profit and fair charging models.
But Joe, it only took you to the second slide to use the word industry to talk about our...
I'm sorry. I know you don't like talking about the eDiscovery sector as an industry, but that's another topic.
That's a whole other topic, yes.
I guess one of the topics I did want to talk about is this notion that I often discuss, which is I fear sometimes that we've over-engineered eDiscovery. Sometimes I get the feeling that we blindly sort of pursue data projects and forget the concept of the case. What is the case all about? This isn't about a data project. It's actually a case. And what is the case all about? And what are we trying to do in relation to the case? And what are we trying to do for our client? I think those of us that have seen the sophistication over the last decade or two have also seen increasing complexity, increasing specialization. But with that, I think sometimes it's very easy to sort of lose sight of the purpose. And there's that wonderful expression, don't let the process overtake the outcome. Why are we doing all of this in the first place? I really like Edward de Bono's perspective on this and the concept of simplicity. Things evolve to become ever more complex, not more simple. And those of us that are involved in the minutiae of how to succeed in relation to the processes that we are managing every day, sometimes don't even notice that we've made it more and more complicated. And it doesn't hurt every now and again to take a big step back and say, why are we doing all of this again? What's eDiscovery for? And anyway, those that are cynical might say where there's mystery, there's margin. As we become more complicated, as we introduce more complexity, obviously there's a bit of a black box there. People don't know what's going on, and then there's an opportunity for increased charging. But that might be a cynic, and I'm not going to be too cynical today. Tom, do you want to talk about workflow a little bit? I mean, what's your thought on the workflow as it exists at the moment in our domain? What are you seeing?
Well, and this goes to the question that someone just asked, I think, about the first question, actually, about should we be paying for processing separately? How do you break that out, et cetera? So I think part of the problem is that, as you know, we use the EDRM chart. You displayed it just a second ago on one of the other slides to talk about our workflow. And the problem is that, as you noted, Joe, we've been doing this for 20 years. And when the EDRM diagram or chart was first scratched out on a cocktail napkin at a conference in, I forget if it was San Francisco, New York. I was at the table with George Sosha, and Browning Marian was there. The idea wasn't really to have a workflow. The idea was to break up the subject matter into discrete areas that could be discussed and devise best practices for each of those. Remember, 20 years ago, I can think of no software that would do each one of those functions. There were separate pieces of software for each of them, and data had to be loaded into one, moved into another, and even in, let's just say, the processing piece, there were different softwares for deduping and threading. So what we had was a series of distinct tasks that needed to be dealt with, and George was trying to come up with a way to look at them and examine them. And then over the years, it's been sort of evolved into a workflow, and then it gets handled in this manner. And as George himself would point out, it isn't even a linear process like the charts would think. Again, that was just for ease of discussion. And then, in fact, some of the tasks you may be continuing or doing continuously throughout your workflow, it's really more of a circle. And I think that's part of the problem, is that we've come to think of that EDRM chart as a workflow process when it isn't. And now, of course, we've got tools that can do, if not all of the individual categories, certainly 90% of them. And so you don't have to move data around. But we haven't stopped questioning why we're still paying as though that's the way things are being handled. And then, of course, the second question is, do we really need, you called it the vacuum cleaner effect, right, Joe? Do we really need to go out and get everything and then kind of sort out the one or two things that we don't want? Is that an effective workflow? Bill Kellerman, who's an attorney who's been in this space for a very long time out on the West Coast, said, we talk so much about things being relevant, but I'm really interested in whether things are probative. I'm looking for the value of the items that I'm finding. I'm not looking for mass quantities. I'm looking for the things that I can use to prove or disprove an item in a pleading. And then I think finally the other part of that is there is oftentimes a confusion between collection and production, or preservation and production. We may have an obligation to preserve a vast majority of data that's relative and or relevant to a matter. That doesn't mean we're going to be obliged to produce it. And so when we winnow down that data to a usable amount, we're becoming much more effective. And so part of the workflow should be, I don't have to collect everything, preserve everything, process everything, and produce everything and let the other side sort it out. There's a much more efficient way to do that meets all of my discovery obligations.
Absolutely. It's a really interesting topic, Tom. I think sometimes what I've seen is that sometimes it's almost as though the common sense button gets kind of deactivated. Because, you see people doing some really bizarre stuff, like collecting a whole lot of really obviously irrelevant stuff and missing the really important stuff. I shared with you before an anecdote about a corporation I worked with once to help them on a very, very large matter. Obviously, I won't mention who it was. And they were very proud of their collection process. They'd organised all the custodians into alphabetical order, and they were gradually progressing through the ingestion of all the data. And they started to panic on the end of the first day. They said, this is going to take us a few days. We're really under pressure here. And I said, well, how many custodians have you got? They said, we've got about 70. And I said, well, who are the key people? And they said, it's Bill and Mary and Fred. And I said, well, why don't you process them first? And they're just, we were doing it in alphabetical order. It's just, and then they said, well, Fred's actually just left. He's left the company, and I think he's picking up his laptop tomorrow. So we won't get his data. It's just, what are you doing? What are you doing? That doesn't always happen. But I think sometimes it's just that bigger picture perspective of, why are we doing this? What's it all for? What's the purpose? And one of the most important things, and I'll keep coming back to this theme, at the very beginning, let's work out who the key people are. Who are the people of interest? Right at the beginning of the case. And that may or may not be one and the same thing as the custodians. Let's sort of hold that thought and come back to it.
And I think that's a good point to make for the entire workflow in general, which is, again, this is a dynamic process, and questions that we're asking, assumptions we're making, processes we're going to follow are going to come up again and again and again. It's not a one and done.
Absolutely. There's another, I think, important concept for us to focus in on occasionally, and that is, the balance between being efficient and effective. And I think sometimes we, as business processes mature and become more specialized and more automated, we've become very efficient. But I think we have to constantly ask ourselves whether we're actually effective. Are we doing the right thing? And a great example that I would give on that topic is proportionality. Sometimes we are so obsessed with getting the number of documents down to a proportionate level that we stop testing, sampling, or validating the documents that we're retaining to ensure that they're the right ones. So we might be proportionate, but we've got the wrong documents. Does that sort of make sense? Am I sort of explaining that properly?
Yeah, I like this graphic because, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody. We find this great new technology. It's wonderful, and the bright, shiny object grabs our attention. But is it the one we need to use at the time? This goes back to the question that was asked at the beginning about, can we segregate some documents, put them into a container, and use some tar, what the questioner said was called skinny tar. Well, one of the questions is there enough volume to make that an effective, an efficient process? Some tar and or predictive coding software is only going to be effective with large data sets or relatively large data sets. So if you've done a lot of culling and reduce that to a number, you need to make sure that the tool you want to use is effective, just as an algorithm is technically effective or efficient with that size of a data set, and whatever types of data you have there as well, of course. So, yeah, I think this is a very key. I've said this before, Joe. The first thing I ask a client on an engagement is, what is it you want to do? What is it you're trying to accomplish here? Are you looking for something specific? Are you looking for something general? Are you trying to avoid a claim? Do you have something filed against you and you're answering specifics in an actual piece of litigation that's been filed? I do a lot of pro bono work with the federal defenders, and I work with an attorney named Russ Aoki, great eDiscovery attorney up in Seattle. And Russ said, when we're talking to people about using software, because he talks to a lot of vendors all the time to keep up on what's going on, he said, first of all, I don't really care about production. I'm a criminal defense attorney. We're not going to be producing anything. Whatever the government wanted of ours, they already took. All right? He said, so we don't need to worry about that. So that tool set is of little or no value to him. And he said, really, the first thing we want to do, and this will go to something you're going to talk about, Joe, is, I'm interested in the corpus of documents that the government has in their possession. Is my guy's name mentioned? First and foremost, the first thing I'm going to do, the first thing any criminal defense attorney is going to do, is a keyword search for his client's name. And so the tools may be great tools, but are they being used efficiently for the task at hand?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Was it Peter Drucker? How do you pronounce his name? Peter Drucker,
Yeah.
who said there's nothing so soul destroying as doing efficiently that which should not be done at all. It's a good segue to this topic I thought we could have some fun with, which is keywords, good old keywords. Now, keywords have got a bit of a bad rap, I think, since tar came on the scene, and to some people, I think they see them as an alternative to tar. So there's this sort of two options. You either go down a tar process or you go down a keyword process, and sometimes you're starting to see keywords used for ECA, and then a tar process kicks in. But I think that one of the problems we have is that keywords have been really badly used. So they can be very, very effective if they're used properly. The problem is that often lawyers think that it's the only tool at their disposal unless they go for the chainsaw, which is predictive coding. So they try to push everything through the keyword paradigm, interpreting every search scenario as a keyword type scenario. So treating every problem like a nail when the keyword is the hammer. A great example of this that we often see is a scenario where you have names being treated like keywords, and it's often overlooked that names are often available as metadata in the to, from, CC fields. So they're extracted in a very nice structured format. And there are far more effective ways that we can find people's names and correspondence information within a data set. This is an example I've taken from Enron, which we're all very familiar with as a data set. But the two key, let's pretend that these two people are key individuals or people of interest. There are so many ways that their names are represented in the data set. And in order to do a search for correspondence between them, typically the approach that many litigators would take would be to try to concoct these very convoluted search terms using keywords and Boolean operators, which is highly ineffective, particularly when you look at all the versions of names of these individuals that are in the source data. Now, the only reason I'm honing in on this is picking up on your theme earlier, Tom. You mentioned that often the focus is on a particular individual. Who are we investigating? Is my client mentioned in the data set? So that person of interest analysis is something that is a very different type of analysis to looking for a key word or a key concept. So person of interest analysis is something that I think we could do so much better in our sector, just using very, very basic technology and database capabilities that every single platform has. I'm not just talking about EDT. Every platform has this capability, and that is to create a single reference for multiple versions of a person's name so that the litigator can go in and say, show me all the correspondence from Bill to Albert or vice versa, and that will automatically bring in all of the multiple representations of that person's name. Now, I'm just honing in on that particular example because it shows an example of a tool being applied inappropriately. They're trying to turn a hammer into a screwdriver, if I could use that data analogy. Does that resonate for you, Tom?
Yeah, this is something that comes up over and over and over again, is that we're, to kind of follow up on the point we made a moment ago, we know what we want to do. In this case, we want to find all the correspondence between Bill and Albert, but now we're in a little different box on that graphic of yours. We're doing the right task, but we're doing it inefficiently. We're not using the right tool, or we're using a good tool, but not in the right way. So matching up what it is you want to do and what's the best way to do it is an ongoing challenge. This is probably a good time to answer that question that the person asked about how do you measure ROI if you're doing this internally, and this is one of the ways. First of all, is this something that you used to send out? Okay, is this a task that you used to send to a vendor? And I don't mean just this one in particular, but any of these eDiscovery tasks. And so then it's very easy to calculate the ROI, right? You're not paying that, whatever that cost was. You can easily calculate that cost. of what it took to send this task. Let's just say searching. Let's just say processing, whatever. And say that we saved that because we're doing that internally ourselves. At the same time, are you saving time? Don't overlook the time savings. And transferring data outside to somebody, waiting for them to work with it, turn around, give you the results, get it back to you. So that's one easy way to measure internally your ROI. But the other one is this, are you using the right tool? Do I have access to a tool internally that will do what I want to do instead of sending it out to somebody to perhaps use the wrong tool? Can I take control of the task and use the right tool, in this case, to find the correspondence in the best possible way? And then I think the third way to measure that ROI is our old friend Mike Quartararo, is the king of project management, will tell you to be monitoring things constantly. You ask what it is you want to do at the beginning, then you ask what it is you want to do for each individual task that you're working on, then you ask what's the best way to do this task, and then you go ahead and start to do it, and then analyze, was that in fact the best way to do this? Project management is a very good way to measure ROI internally.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's it might be a good a point at which to talk briefly about the predictive coding sort of process. You know, we both acknowledge the fact that there's absolutely a role for it, but it is just one of many tools that we have in our toolkit, and it's not a silver bullet. You know, it's not going to solve all problems and magically sort of find all of the documents we need. I think sometimes it's really inappropriately applied and not really well understood, and I know that Maura Grossman would probably agree with us on that front. I think it's really interesting to see that often the concept of precision and recall isn't really understood by lawyers. They're sort of foundational concepts. And, you know, the balance between precision and recall, if you're trying to get really high precision, it might actually have an inverse impact on recall. You know, you might get an enormous volume of documents because you've set the precision target so high, and that blows your proportionality argument out the door. So it's sort of it's an interesting one, isn't it?
So let me be clear there, Joe. You just said that it's rarely understood, not really understood. Am I correct?
Well, yeah. Choose the word you want to use there. I guess
Yeah.
you know, either would work.
I think that, but I think it's important to say too, and I don't want to speak for you. I don't want to put words in your mouth. You know, I'm a big believer in predictive coding. I think there's great stuff going on with active learning, especially Maura with her continuous active learning. But and I think you feel the same way. But it's the right tool at the right time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we're not saying that predictive coding is not a good tool. It's just to be applied the right way. You know, Ralph Losey, who's a great commentator in this area, proposes what he calls a multimodal way of working, which is just a different way, I think, of saying what we're talking about, which is to use different tools at different steps of the process and find the right mix for the case that you're working on.
Absolutely. And I think that's where things are going. I think what we're going to see increasingly is AI, and I'm using that term specifically because I'm really trying to avoid reference to tar. Sorry, Gail, did you? Gail?
Hello?
Hello,
Oh.
Was there a question there?
I'm sorry, I was interrupted. Keep going.
Okay,
Sorry.
No problem. I think what we're going to see increasingly is that multiple tools will be applied throughout the case, depending upon the circumstances and the facts and the data sets at hand. And I really feel that what's going to happen is there's going to be an underlying AI engine. And I use that term purposefully because I'm trying to avoid the debate about what is tar and what is not tar. what I'm really talking about is continuous active learning, and that active learning pipeline, if you like, is informed by the results of the application of the other tools. So, for example, there are so many things that we could be doing that we're not yet even tapping into, that are very well tested, tried and proven technologies around now. Named entity recognition, jargon detection, we're having some fun with that actually within our team. Sentiment analysis is obviously of critical importance to a lot of cases. The question is, how do you apply it? And that's a whole booming area potentially. Geodata analysis. We've been doing some work on profanity detection, which is quite interesting, not just in terms of inappropriate images, but also inappropriate language, or language that indicates a heightened state of stress, which can sometimes be of probative value in terms of the evidence that you're trying to glean in relation to a case. And there are so many other things that we could be doing, but these are all the tools that we could use within our pipeline, and the output of these tools actually becomes features for an active learning framework. So I think that's where things are going to go, and I think that requires really new thinking about the problem at hand and the objectives that we're actually trying to achieve.
Yeah, I agree. I think, again, this comes back to what do you want to do? And how much can you do at the front end? But that's a question you need to not just ask at the beginning, but continue to ask as you're working.
And Tom, just to elaborate on that a little bit more, I know that we've spoken about this before, but I'm harping on again about this old topic. But I really do think that litigators could really benefit from some of the techniques that our colleagues, the investigators, have been applying to data sets. So much of what we are doing is tainted by the history, which is a perception that we need to either review or somehow process, maybe through TAR or other techniques, every document in a collected data set. Whereas if we approach the problem differently, looking for evidence to support the story, I think it really introduces very different opportunities and potentially some great value and very quick outcomes for clients.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is, and this has come up in discussions all over, is the role, if you will, the way that litigators work has dramatically changed in the last 10 or 12 years. So first of all, the number of cases, the number of civil cases that go to trial in federal court is down to about 1%. In state courts, it's under 10%. So there's been a dramatic decline in the number of matters that go to trial over the last 10, 12, 14 years. And in many cases, part of that, I think, has been replaced by the arguments over eDiscovery. That's become sort of the mini trial, if you will, or the pre-trial that decides how cases are disposed. But that requires a different set of skills and much more technical underpinnings. And so I think in many cases, because we've got less people learning how to go to trial, they've forgotten or perhaps have never learned some of this. Gail and I have a neighbor who's a 3L, and he just accepted a job at a large firm in Houston, and he said he didn't want to go into litigation because he didn't see any future in it. He's going to be a transactional attorney at this firm. And so these skills, talking about the storytelling, the who, why, where, when, I think we've lost those because we're looking more at the data sets and asking some of those. We're asking what's the recall rate, not the who, why, and where. I think we have to get back to this. We have to get back to this.
Absolutely. I think the first one to really focus on is the who. Who are the people of interest? And, we can really build some amazing analytics around that approach in itself, even if we, at the beginning of a case, try to identify who the actors are or the people we're interested in investigating. And they may or may not, as I said, be custodians, because we may or may not be able to get their data sets. Very interesting to see that Kenneth Lay, the CEO of Enron, is not a custodian in the Enron data set. Yet we can glean from the other data that was collected quite a bit of information about that particular individual. So building up a story around the who, you know, their social network, their sentiment at particular key points in time, relationships, who were they communicating with, when and why, what are the various personas that they had within the case, and really taking our analysis from that perspective, I think is you know, the way to go in the future, particularly when you consider the fact that people are communicating through so many different channels now. Snapchat, Facebook Messenger, email, text. Email is increasingly less prevalent. So if we focus less on the technology and the data and more on the story, then we can start to really build things like, you know, a conversation paradigm, for example. Whether the conversation is in Facebook Messenger or text or Snapchat or email, it doesn't really matter. Having a platform neutral construct like a conversation, I think is the opportunity on the horizon for all of us as we start to develop methodologies that are technology neutral but pervasive long term in terms of what we're trying to achieve.
And I think this also, if I might harken back to Barbara or Susan's question at the very beginning, focusing like this allows you to create those smaller data sets, which allow you to build those skinny tar protocols, if you will, because you're not dealing with everything. You're not dealing with the whole vacuum cleaner full of dust, and all you're looking for is the you know, the house key that you dropped under the couch several weeks ago. You're hoping the vacuum picked that up. You know, this sort of approach allows you to focus in early, very much similar to what you described earlier, Joe, where you had a case with a lot of custodians, but only 3 or 4 of them were very important, and so we're going to focus in on them first and then see what we have. You know, some people call that sampling. I'm a big fan of it, no matter what you call it. There isn't a need to collect everything and process everything. It's just not cost effective. And by being selective like this, you can, I'm mindful of, I mentioned this earlier, our old friend Gene Eames at Pfizer, when we were having a discussion about this once, said, you know, you're boiling the ocean. I think you put a slide in here at some point. Did you, Joe, about that?
I think I've got a nice visual for you. There you go.
Yeah. Gene said, you know, you've got these great tools, but you're trying to boil the ocean of data. Why not take a pot and fill the pot with water and boil the pot and see what you got, see what your results are before you try to, you know, take on a task that may be enormously expensive, not insurmountable, if not impossible to do. Certainly with the amount of data that's being created every year and what we are faced with in terms of data stores, and as you said, Joe, all sorts of new data types, much better to focus in on the who to begin with and see what's important. And then we can branch out from there as needed.
Absolutely. I think another type of thinking that is not as prevalent as it could be is the notion of using very, again, well-tested and proven approaches to find similar documents. Now, this is often confused with what we call near dupe. Now, a near dupe is often used generally to reference documents that people want to detect as text-based duplicates so that they can cull them out during a pre-processing stage. Although, again, I refer to the fact that there's very little definition, so who knows? You know, people define near dupe very differently. But what I'm referring to is the potential and enormous value that we can get by finding one hot document, and this might actually be an answer, one of many potential answers to that question that was posed to us earlier. if you can find a couple of hot documents, find a few really hot documents, use those documents to find similar documents. And a good similarity analysis engine will not only pick up the text, the bag of words in the document, the text, it will also pick up the metadata and other features like the existence of profanity, the sender characteristics, a range of other elements. So I really think that this notion of finding a few key documents and then expanding until you find similar ones is an opportunity that we are yet to really fully explore as a common aid to the way we litigate.
Yep.
And one of our attendees today just wrote exactly, if this were the old paper days and you walked into a warehouse full of boxes, think Raiders of the Lost Ark, you'd focus your efforts on likely boxes, see what you found, and then expand with direction.
Absolutely. Start with what you know and then expand out. Think about the throwing a pebble into a pond. You start with that sort of that inner sort of wave of development, and then sort of expand out. And really, when you look behind some of the algorithms that are behind the most effective active learning engines, that's inherently what they're doing. But it is an important technique because lawyers understand this stuff, and it's easy to explain in court, it's easy to explain to a judge, and it's easy to explain to a client, because anyone that uses Pandora or Yelp or any of these sort of social media apps that know how to profile you and find similar things that you might be interested in will very easily understand what a find similar algorithm is doing. And I really think that's an opportunity we really need to tap into in terms of new methodologies and smarter ways of working in our industry.
Yep.
I've done a lot of talking, Tom. I hope I haven't I haven't railroaded anything you wanted to mention. Is there anything else you sort of think we should touch on? I'm watching the time here, and I realise, Gail, we should take a few questions. Are there any other questions?
Tom, have you got any questions there?
Somebody asked me a little bit more about proportionality, and it's, traditionally under the federal rules, proportionality is you're not going to spend more on a task than the value of the case, and you can't be forced to do that. If your defense to searching for a number of documents is, well, that's going to cost me X, and the case is only worth 1/3 of X, then I have a legitimate reason to object to doing that. And it's something that and this goes again to the first question we had from Susan, and also the one about internal ROI. The most often overlooked topic here is the actual cost of doing these different technological feats. People talk, for example, with predictive coding about how effective it is and efficient, faster than humans, but what's the cost? What is the actual cost? And I suggest that will be a hard thing for you to pin down in proportionality when you're considering it. But you want to try to figure out exactly what these items are going to cost you. And don't forget to factor in time as well. And that's also, of course, one of the factors. It's where the proportionality argument comes from. Rule 1 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure says that all matters shall be handled in a manner that is just, speedy, and inexpensive. And I think we often talk about just, and we almost always talk about speedy, but nobody likes to talk about inexpensive. And that kind of goes to some of the pricing models that Joe and I talked about at the beginning, that we're not going on the per gigabyte price anymore. A lot of times we're talking about one inclusive price for everything, for all those individual costs.
I've just got a new question, actually two.
Yep.
Real quickly, what pricing model do you recommend? Per gigabyte, all in, hourly, not to exceed? And the other question, just so you can think about this, is Tom, who is the greatest ESI consultant of all time? And that is from an anonymous attendee.
Is that an anonymous attendee on a cruise ship going through the Panama Canal by any chance?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think so.
I'll let you answer that one, Tom.
Well, of course it's Greg Ball. Everybody knows it's Greg Ball.
I thought it was Tom O'Connor.
Hey, listen, let me answer that first one, though. I am a big believer in the all-in pricing model if, and this is a very big if you have a good handle on everything that's going to be done and what all the individual tasks are, as Joe said. If you have a sense of how much data you have at the source and what that's going to turn out to be when you want to handle it later. It's easy to say we're going to give you an all-in pricing, but sometimes it's hard to come up with that figure given the different parameters. And I think the other thing is that you still have to consider hourly pricing for some of the what I'll call the odds and ends, right? Which is if somebody needs to help you come up with a keyword search protocol, if somebody needs to go to a meet and confer with you. Obviously, you have strict consulting hours that go into a case, and you're going to need that. And sometimes there's some technical tasks, setting up the case, preparing the server, et cetera, which shouldn't be lengthy at all, but I think are legitimate reasons to charge an hourly service fee. But again, all of that I think can be easily set up at the front end of the case. I am simply not a believer in the per gig per user per month paradigm anymore.
Okay.
I'll add to that very quickly, Gail. I really think that the future is platform as a service, not software as a service, platform as a service. And that is software plus infrastructure, cloud infrastructure, secure cloud infrastructure with software on top of it. And the whole thing is bundled up as a turnkey thing, which is a platform.
And Joe, does EDT do that?
Yes, we do.
All right.
You've got to allow me one plug, Gail.
Well,
in 1 hour, you have to allow me one plug. But seriously, it's so important that per gigabyte rates are not inflated. And
right.
the way to do that is to do a platform as a service, because that way the cloud storage savings, which are extraordinarily significant, can be passed on all the way through to the law firm and ultimately to the client. And that, I think, is fair pricing.
And let me, if I could, though, real quickly, Joe, say that in some cases, there isn't an ability to mount that in the cloud. I think we all know of government agencies, for example, both mostly state level in the United States, state and local, and some federal cases where there are prohibitions against cloud maintenance, and so you still want the ability, which I know you have, Joe, to mount things behind your own firewall with all the same buildings.
Absolutely, and that's where good old-fashioned software licensing kicks in, and that's got nothing to do with a per gigabyte charge. So that's another very fair pricing model.
I've got two final questions that might need to be addressed offline. One from Susan Haight, that maybe you could get back to her regarding, should an ED custodian be covered by the now active GDPR? Any thoughts on how you could have an active learning framework, unlearn someone or some topic related to that someone that requests to be forgotten?
Yeah, that's a little more than we can talk about now, although you're doing another session later today, aren't you, Gail? On
yes, we are on the GDPR, and that will be at 1 o'clock Pacific Standard Time.
Susan, we'll get back to you. We'll get back to you with an answer on that, though.
Okay,
yeah,
and also from your friends at Chad Pappenfuss, he indicated that Tom is the greatest ESI consultant from your CO friends, and we love Joe as well. So,
thank you, Chad.
Joe, if you want to pop up the last slide.
Big group hug. Absolutely. I'll just find
a slide to thank people for their attendance today.
Oh, there it is.
And we will have this available on the Xterra website as an on-demand webinar, and it will also be available on the EDT as well as the gltc.org website, GLTC. Tom, what's your website again?
Yeah, Gulf Coast Legal Tech.
GulfCoastLegalTech.org.
Yep.
And EDT, it's called DiscoverEDT.com. And both the webinar will be available. Give it a couple days after this session today. So I want to thank Joe and I want to thank Tom for their attendance today. If you do have any final questions, please feel free to send those off to me at gayle@discoveredt.com, Gayle, Gayle @discoveredt.com, and Joe and Tom will address those post-webinar today. So I wanted to thank everyone for joining us on eDiscovery Day. Joe and Tom, thank you for your time and your dedication to this topic. I'm sure everyone appreciates it. And everyone have a wonderful, wonderful eDiscovery Day.
Thank you so much, Gail. Appreciate it. Thanks, Tom. Bye.
Bye-bye.